Well, hello. Hi, everyone. Bodø. Uh, please excuse my slow pace and my bit of sleepiness. I'm calling in from what is currently called Minneapolis, Minnesota in the United States. So that is Anishinaabe and Dakota land. And my name is Áila. I'm a philosopher and I've been working. Well, I'm going to introduce myself, and I would love to hear your thoughts on a particular puzzle in philosophy that I've been grappling with. So the overview briefly. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, why this puzzle matters to me and my family in the profession of philosophy, and briefly note that an idea that I've been working with is, as a philosopher, is SIDA as an Indigenous kinship ethic. But halfway into this work, I started grappling with the ethics of engaging Indigenous kinship ethics in the discipline of philosophy, given the history of violence of the discipline of philosophy. And I'm rather quite stuck in that grappling. So this is my attempt to kind of talk through a little bit about what's at stake here. And I would love to hear your thoughts. This is my introduction photo slide. So like I said, my name is Áila O'Loughlin, and both my parents are from immigrant families to the United States. My dad is from Ireland and my mom is Sámi from the Finnish side of the border of Sápmi. And growing up, I've got half my Irish, family on one side here, and my Sámi family on the other side. And growing up, for example, I saw my Irish grandparents as philosophers. My Irish grandfather has a medical degree as well as a PhD, and did research in medicine, taught at UCLA, moved to the States to teach at UCLA. My Sámi grandfather had something like an 8th grade education in part of the Finnish education system at the time in the 30s, which was primarily an education in the Finnish language, being his second language, and that was it. And likewise, growing up, I delineated. I said, "Oh, this is what education looks like on one half of my family. This is what philosophy looks like on one half of my family, and not the other." So, the more I studied philosophy, and they got me hooked. I'm 4 degrees in at this point. I came to see that both my Sámi grandparents were philosophers in their daily practice and their considerations of how we ought to engage with the world, with other persons, with our community, with our other than human relations. And of course, the field of Native American and Indigenous studies in the United States and Canada has language for this. Through scholars like Leanne Simpson or Christopher Pexa, and my Sámi grandparents and my mother have a practice of Indigenous kinship ethics. So I started working with looking at Indigenous kinship ethics as a normative theory. So, I mean, I don't know how many. Philosophy has all kinds of funny words for everyday things, right? That we talk about in our everyday lives, and they like to make a jargon out of it. But a normative ethic, right, like utilitarianism, like Kantianism. I'm just going to pause and open this door for my cat. So a normative ethic, like utilitarianism, like Kantianism, tells us not simply what is right or wrong, but why this is right or wrong, acts as a guide to contextual, specific, right action. And if we look at Native American Indigenous studies scholars like Leon Simpson, Christopher Pexa, Daniel Heath Justice, we see this outline of a normative ethic, an Indigenous kinship ethic. So I've been working with kind of just naming what's already there in the discipline of philosophy. I'm an ethicist, do ethics, practical ethics in the discipline of philosophy. And so I read Indigenous kinship ethics for these scholars as having a central value of kinship, enacting that through a criterion of reciprocity, and then having certain qualities like it's this ethic, this normative ethic is land-based, is collective. It belongs to Indigenous people in thought and sovereignty. And the normative ethic of Indigenous kinship ethics guides us in how to cultivate a relationality that has specific qualities as well. Like it's expansive to both our human relations and our other than human relations. It's non-hierarchical, it's non-possessive and reciprocal. So for any ethic, normative ethic, we end up with good questions. And I love the ways that I see Indigenous kinship ethics asking good questions of our lives toward right action. So here's some good ones from Daniel Heath Justice, a Canadian scholar and an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation. And he asks, how do we behave as good relatives? How do we become good ancestors? What are our relational rights and responsibilities to one another and to the other than human world? How do we create the kind of world and relationships that will nurture those who come after and give them cause to thank us rather than curse or grieve our destructive selfishness? So likewise, I see this concept of, I see the practice and I see the term of SIDA as a place-based Indigenous kinship ethic. And I'm not the first person to make this claim. There are Sami scholars talking about SIDA as Indigenous kinship ethic, and there are American scholars. This is a nice illustrative quote from Kyle White, a philosopher that works at University of Michigan. And Dr. White specifically works on the problem of climate crisis and environmental justice. And is looking at various Indigenous kinship ethics that are contextual and place-based, and how those ethical systems serve to motivate humans to be responsible for protecting the environment. And that's how the word SIDA was taught to me by my grandparents, as roughly translating to the word community, but really meaning to whom we are responsible. And to me, this is this quite brilliant ethical framework, to be honest, right? That I would love to write about and I think comes to bear on puzzles like environmental justice. However, halfway through this work, I have significant hesitations. And this is not with Indigenous kinship ethics or SIDA as Indigenous kinship ethics, but with the ethics of engaging this work in the discipline of philosophy. And that is where I'm stuck. So there are two main hesitations I have in engaging with Indigenous kinship ethics and philosophy. So hesitation one has to do with the past, but the past that is still present, and that is philosophy's role in a history of violence against Indigenous persons, Indigenous sovereignty and thought. This is well documented by other philosophers. So, reading Justin Smith, who summarizes this practice as, imbuing Indigenous peoples with native know-how, yet without the capacity to know or hold knowledge. Early modern philosophy from Kant, Hegel, Bernier is explicitly marginalizing and dehumanizing to Indigenous persons, including, this, it's like, how much of the bad stuff do you include, out loud in this presentation? But, including Immanuel Kant, like a prince of philosophy per se, who comments that the natural disposition of the Native American reveals a half-extinguished life power in his anthropological work. So, there are lots of examples. that illustrate not only intellectual violence, but what leads to a history of land theft, of colonization. And philosophy has played a large role in that. Even examples of, for example, like Lars Levi Lastidius as someone who does philosophical work and is from Sami heritage. And this quote specifically, says, "Oh, Sami folks could never become such great philosophers." And so there's been this is the legacy of violence that the discipline of philosophy, like many academic disciplines, has to reconcile with. The second hesitation I have about engaging indigenous kinship ethics in the discipline of philosophy is not about the past. That's not the past, but specifically the present. And it's the way that philosophy continues to situate itself as a story without a storyteller. And I find that this might be antithetical to practice of indigenous kinship ethics as one of accountability, of one of collectivity, of one of plurality. But as is present, philosophy very much maintains a project to reveal the truth, assuming that there is one singular truth that we are ebbing away at in the world. And other brilliant philosophers such as Christy Dotson or Maria Lugones talk about this practice in the way it comes up in conversation in philosophy, in scholarship. Dotson refers to this as a culture of justification, is what in her piece, is this paper, what makes this paper philosophy, right? So these are two hesitations that give me reason to pause in doing work that in philosophy that I believe to be important. And so I think here are some of the questions that I've come down to kind of ruminating on, which include who benefits from highlighting Sami philosophy in the discipline of philosophy? What risks are involved for Sami people in Sapmi or in diaspora, Sami sovereignty, land, knowledge, and traditions? How ought philosophy as a discipline acknowledge a legacy of violence onto indigenous peoples in thought? And how ought philosophy as a discipline affirm a reality that we are still here as philosophers, as Sami American philosophers, as Sami philosophers, while navigating a past that is not past and this present of philosophy as a story without a storyteller. So that is where I'm at in this work, and a summary of my thinking. I would love to hear if anyone had comments or questions. And I will stop sharing.
Any comments or questions? You can also raise your hand or write your name in the chat if you have any comments. Otherwise, I have always questions or comments. I think the presentation was really interesting, and I think that also kind of starting with kinship is really interesting, because it is, even though it's often taken for granted that kinship means the same thing in different cultures, but for example, kinship is a very kind of fundamental basis for interaction and relations in Sami communities that also function in a quite different way also from, for example, Norwegian ideas about kinship, and kind of the idea about also kind of the link between kind of the you and your ancestors and you and the land, and how you also present yourself. And for example, it's still quite common to present yourself with kind of listing the names of your kind of 4 or 3 of your kind of direct lineage, for example, or also the idea about, for example, ritual kinship, or the idea about gaimi, kind of name brother, and then the importance of the name and kinship through also kind of that it's when you meet another Sami, for example, you want to know who they are and who they are related to, and maybe if they're related to you, and I think that when you think about kinship in that way, it also says something about how you kind of see the world and the worldview and ethics, and how do you think that kind of can apply in a kind of philosophical way to kind of challenge also how our kind of taken for granted ideas about how the world looks, and how we also are responsible for taking care of land and nature and the environment?
Yeah, I think this is the illustration of the importance of kinship that you just gave, is why I want to keep engaging with Indigenous kinship ethics in philosophy, especially in ethics and when it comes to moral responsibility. I think from a normative view, perhaps in utilitarianism or Kantianism, we have moral duties to others, and to perhaps like not interfere or not cause harm, which is a minimum. We have moral duties to others at a moral minimum. And when we're thinking through our choices within a lens of kinship, we're thinking about how to develop and cultivate and honor healthy relationality between people, which requires more than a moral minimum. So that is this idea is very exciting to me, how to move past what I can't do to others toward, what is a joy and honor to do for others in a community that is connected through active kinship. And I think we get very different results about prescriptive moral claims in that case. Like what are our individual responsibilities in climate crisis, for example, or what I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota, that for the past 2 years has been rebuilding after much of the city burned in response to the murder of George Floyd, for example. And I have witnessed, and I think this is actually where this work started, my city in large part acting through a kinship imperative. So, acting as not at a moral minimum. Okay, how do I go forth and not murder or not interfere or not disrespect people, but what's available to me in my own life to serve as a good relative to my community or to my city as we rebuild buildings, as we create alternative community safety models. And I think I see my grandfather's ideas about SIDA at work in my city. And I think, that's part of the beauty of kinship.
Can you maybe say something about, you mentioned this kind of other than human perspective, and how you think this links to, for example, it's for example in feminist studies and science and technology studies, it's very kind of popular to talk about kind of more than human and perspectives. But I think that kind of indigenous perspectives on other than human relations and how that works in understanding the world is a little bit different, especially regarding kind of the more spiritual links to more the spiritual part of also and also the role of kinship in relation to that. And I think that's something that often is missed in kind of normal other than human perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, especially from a lens of moral duty, or reciprocity, especially also as well. I as an individual only exist because of my relations. I am who I am, my personality, my sustenance. is because of my relations. And that is not limited to human relations. I am who I am. I can live on this land because of my other than human relations that teach me how to build a house, that provide nourishment. So there's less of a clean or discrete separation. Oh, here's the moral status of human persons. Here's the moral status of other than human relations. It is, they're like all relations, all various relations that have to do with a web that creates that, like part of the web of kinship that are included in stories that we tell on how to live a good life, or how we learned to not be like the ills of greed, for example, right? Or how to share between groups or nations, whether that's a whole nation of other than human persons. So yeah, I like which is absent from most other normative ethics. Utilitarianism does include other than human persons as like agents of like suffering or happiness that we should attend to. But again, then the rule becomes we shouldn't cause suffering onto other than human persons, which is this moral minimum, as opposed to how do I engage with other than human persons? How do I engage with water? How do I engage with, I mean, in Minnesota, especially, there's a large movement of water protection from Anishinaabe and Dakota peoples because of the oil pipelines being placed through reservation land in northern Minnesota. And so thinking with kinship, including, for example, water as an other than human relation, leads to different kinds of moral responsibilities. Oh, that's my relation that is being threatened up in northern Minnesota. So what do I have available? And in my life, I've got a car, I can bring supplies. And how can I best cultivate healthy water for water's sake that's not just dependent on my needs? And also healthy water in a relationship that I have with water.
I see you have a comment in the chat, Carol. Do you want to say something or ask a question?
I'll start out with a comment, and I don't know where it will lead. Thank you so much for your presentation. I've never had formal training in philosophy, so my absorption was probably limited, but I nonetheless appreciated the presentation greatly. And then what you said about Minneapolis, which the murder of George Floyd has unfortunately resonated around not only the US, but around the world. I was really struck, for example, by the news that there were Black Lives Matter protests in Norway, as well as so many other places. But thinking anew about Minneapolis, I reflect on the rebuilding of community and a new understanding of community, I think, amongst some of us in the wake of white supremacist murder and violence here in Charlottesville, which is where I live. And I live right downtown, where the center of the activity. And and so that occurred in 2017. And a word that occurs to me now is to characterize the community is resilience. And I think anew about that experience of sharing a sense of resilience in my community, building the sense of resilience because of what you have said. Now, so I guess this leads to a question that is a way tangential, but in another way that I can't articulate. Not, where do you think you will go with your grappling with this potential to rebuild community after a ripping apart of community?
Well, I appreciate that connection. I don't think I've thought about my grappling in analogous abstraction like that, right? Because the hesitations I have about engaging Indigenous kinship ethics in philosophy have to do with tearing apart community. But I hadn't made that connection before, honestly. So that's why I am grateful to present. And to be completely honest and transparent, I'm not sure. I think my inclination at this point is to kind of stake out that there are better and worse ways to rebuild community after this breaking apart of community. And what do the worst ways look like? What do the better ways look like? And actually, I find Indigenous kinship ethics to be very valuable in this work, right? How do we, like, better ways to rebuild community include plural ways. There isn't one best model for community. There isn't a hegemonic model for community, for example, as well as non-hierarchical ways, non-possessive ways. So perhaps then the answer to how ought we engage with Indigenous kinship ethics in this discipline of philosophy that has actively been a part in the past of reducing a possibility for Indigenous kinship ethics to thrive is to do it with a notion of kinship, with a notion of SIDA, and thinking about what that might look like. What does writing philosophy, what does writing even look like? What does scholarship look like with like a primary value of kinship, engaging kinship in that writing and scholarship? Are perhaps circular thoughts, but that's what comes to mind. How do we do this well? We probably do it through valuing kinship and reciprocity as a large part of that.
Thank you again.
Thank you for your question.
Great, thank you, Áila. I think we take a 10-minute break now and start at 10:30 as planned.